Thank you, Ryan, for coming on the Objections podcast. I wanted to talk to you about the running chronology that you've kept on just security on Mark Meadows and the scandal we've been seeing now, particularly with Jeffrey Clark at the DOJ. Can you give me a broad overview when you started keeping this chronology, what you discovered when you started putting all of this together?
Sure, thanks. So this part of the chronology, we were focused kind of like a laser beam on Mark Meadows' particular role. So the big findings there are that he actually starts popping up at all the major intersections where it appears as though President Trump is trying to overturn the election. And, the bottom line is not only is Mark Meadows apparently engaging in illegitimate behavior by all of these contacts with the Justice Department in violation of both White House and Justice Department policy, involvement in the Trump campaign in terms of setting up a quote unquote parallel track, according to Michael Bender, Wall Street Journal reporter's book, with Giuliani. So a parallel track, it echoes like the Ukraine impeachment, a parallel track with a private attorney working with the political campaign for Trump's reelection. But much more seriously, I think he has a lot of criminal exposure, that this really is the kind of facts that are at the heartland of the criminal penalties under, like, for just one example, the Hatch Act, trying to pressure the Justice Department to work on the behalf of Trump's reelection. And so I think it makes it quite significant where he might end up. Like, does he end up before a grand jury? Or does he end up before the select committee testifying? And, that's the kind of where I'm trying to keep my eye on that ball to some extent.
And one locus of the chronology that popped out to me is he pops up when there's the introduction being made into the arm of the DOJ, which, as recent report has indicated, Jeffrey Clark. Can you unpack that connection?
Yeah, so it's just this one line that's in the Michael Bender book, but then it starts to fill out to much greater extent. So Michael Bender reports that it is Mark Meadows who helps introduce Jeff Clark, who's a lower level DOJ official, directly to the president. Then we know from New York Times reporting that the president and Jeff Clark are engaged in these ex parte communications unbeknownst to senior DOJ leadership. And Jeff Clark is plotting to oust the acting attorney general, Jeff Rosen. And it's Mark Meadows who has set that ball in motion. And now if you look at other parts of the timeline, it is Mark Meadows, one of those nefarious, there's no better word for it, emails from Mark Meadows to the Department of Justice. In fact, tasks the Department of Justice. He says to Rosen, can you get Jeff Clark to look into these allegations of anomalies in Georgia? And we now know, Jeff Clark has these bizarre conspiracy theories that he's cooking up about, Chinese thermometers changing ballots. It's even hard to say those words. So the fact that Meadows is then pushing Clark inside the Justice Department as kind of that would be the point person. And, it raises other questions that we wait for investigative reporting or the committee to find out, which is how much is Meadows himself involved in those communications, ex parte communications with Trump and Clark, because that really does seem like the coup, one of the schemes. And it's very hard to imagine that Meadows would not be in the loop. I mean, my goodness, he would be the gatekeeper to the White House and to President Trump. And it sounds like several contacts, including a meeting between Clark and Trump before the senior Justice Department officials even knew that was going on.
And constant communication on January 6th itself, correct?
Yeah, so there's this other one in which Mark Meadows is apparently in constant communication with Kash Patel, Chief of Staff to the Acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller, on January 6th, according to Kash Patel. And that's not a good place to be. So, from a lot of the Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker book and others, we there's a lot of suspicion around Kash Patel and his installment inside the Defense Department. And it seemed to alarm a lot of other people, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and Pompeo. So for Kash Patel to say, I was in constant contact and communication with Mark Meadows on January 6th, is not a good sign for either person.
As someone, you were special counsel for the Department of Defense. What is it like seeing all of this surrounding, as you noted, Kash Patel? There's been a lot of suspicion about his installment there. All of this unfolding around him, plus the revelations that you noted in the Philip Rucker book. What is it like seeing all of this play out at the Pentagon?
So I think in some sense, it's deeply concerning. And I was, trying to choose my word. Was I going to say the word frightening? I mean, it's deeply concerning or frightening. So just reading about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it sounds like, and the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were deeply concerned that President Trump was going to use the military to hold onto power. And he held that concern until Inauguration Day, it sounds like, as well, from the Lennig and Rucker book. And that is very worrisome. And I think that's, to me, one of the important issues for the Select Committee, which is that the Select Committee, of course, needs to follow the track of how much is Donald Trump and other close associates responsible for January 6th. But there's this other track, which I think just raises profound public policy questions. How much are our law enforcement, military, and intelligence agencies susceptible to political pressure or ideological or white supremacist influences? And I think the DOD is one area that has to be investigated, and FBI, DHS are others.
And last week, of course, when all of this news came out about Jeffrey Clark and what was going on at the DOJ, in short order, there was the report that Jeff Rosen started immediately talking to the January 6th committee, perhaps concerned that someone would try to keep him from cooperating. What's your read on what's going on, and what does this bode for the work of that commission?
So it seems like there are two parallel tracks. The Senate Judiciary Committee, which has spoken to Rosen and Donoghue, the acting Deputy Attorney General, and then you have the Select Committee that's going to be speaking to them as well, in all likelihood, it looks like. And so I think that might be, so one read is, I think that might, it's interesting why they have both going on, that maybe one is a backup. For example, if the House flips and for some reason the Select Committee has not finished its work, you have the Senate that might still be operating, is one thought about why they're both operating in some sense. Though I think that the Select Committee will finish up its work before the end of the term. And then the other piece of it is the news from last week that Speaker Pelosi had decided to shift these witnesses from House Oversight and Reform to the Select Committee. And there are just many reasons why that might be the case, that they'd want to do that. But I did think about one piece of it, which might be speculative, but a lot less likely to leak. And they do want to speak to these people very confidentially so that they can get their information. And then it makes it much more difficult for others to lie to the committee who come next. And I think Jeff Clark will come next, or one of the next witnesses. And that's because the Select Committee has a unity of purpose, which seems to be this fact-finding, truth-seeking. And if you left it in House Oversight Committee, it's just kind of fascinating to think about the staff of Jim Jordan being in the room, and Gosar and Biggs being in that room, and how difficult that might be to manage compared to what we now have. And then the only other question in my mind is a big one, how they might be coordinating or not with the Justice Department, so that the missing piece is no indication whatsoever that the Justice Department currently has a criminal investigation, even though so many of us legal commentators have been saying this looks like criminal activity.
And what do you think about the whole, does it seem, obviously, as you noted, there has been no indication that the Justice Department has been looking into it. Would the Justice Department ever necessarily tip their hand if such a probe were going on? Is it, to put another way, kind of the normal state of play that you find the lower level actors as you're building the potentially more sensitive cases?
Yeah. So I definitely think the Justice Department would keep absolutely mum, and that this Justice Department in particular would be pretty good at doing that, so that there would be no leaking or public statements that they're investigating. And some listeners and viewers might think that the Department of Justice does speak about ongoing investigations because of what we saw over the last 4 years, including Bill Barr doing that, but he was violating Justice Department policy time and again. And in a certain sense, Jim Comey confirming a counterintelligence investigation involving the president, which he did in testimony. But those are just extraordinarily unusual for law enforcement and the Justice Department. So I don't think we'd hear anything from them in any public way, or even, like anonymous sources coming out of the Justice Department. But I do think we would have a pretty good likelihood of hearing from defense attorneys wanting to speak to reporters and leak the information, so that oftentimes when such a high profile investigation is going on, they might find it in their interest of their clients to do so. We also saw that with the kind of conspiratorial or conspiracy involving Trump and their associates time and again, which I think they were also trying to communicate with each other by being very public about when they were being brought before Congress or being brought in criminal investigations. So that's why I think, the dog that hasn't barked or something of that sort, it's notable that's what I mean by it. That's what I'm thinking about. No indication that there's an investigation right now.
True, that the Justice Department may be able to control what comes out of its office, but not necessarily all of the offices of the many defense counsel that are involved. Right. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
So one kind of big picture question. So your outlet, Just Security, focuses, as the name indicates, on national security. Throughout your tenure there, how have you seen the national security threats against the United States shift in the pre-January 6th to the post-January 6th era?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest shift is and it's kind of interesting as we come on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, that the biggest shift is from counterterrorism that was perceived as, even just saying the words, about the threats from external militia groups that were associated with 9/11 and those associated with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, to the domestic threat of terrorism and terrorist groups and militia groups here. And it's not that the threat wasn't there, it's more of the awareness of the threat, I think. And that January 6th brings it to the foreground. And I think in my own thinking, it's part of the reason that I am so focused on January 6th. I think of it as such an important inflection point for our country's dealing with white supremacist violence, and that is the national security threat in terms of understanding how severe it is. And just to have, I think ABC News broke the story on Friday that the DHS has issued yet another bulletin of the serious concern that people who are motivated by their idea of the lost cause of January 6th and other conspiracies, the real threat of political violence in this country that is part of the current threat matrix, I think is huge, just absolutely huge. And the study that also just came out, I think it was also on Friday, from the University of Chicago, a political science research group that found 21 million Americans believe two thoughts. One, that Biden is an illegitimate president, and two, it is legitimate to use force to restore Trump to power. 21 million Americans. And many of those Americans are also very well armed. So it's just, so I think, that's to me the kind of axial shift in my own thinking, at least, about the national security issues that Just Security is focused on historically and then currently.
Mm. And as alarming as that data point is, isn't there something, in a sense, entirely predictable of if you have a former head of state having millions of people actually believe that they are essentially being ruled by a president whom they believe to be illegitimate, doesn't that threat necessarily follow? When millions and millions of people take the follow-up thought that would come from that?
100%. Yes. And I think the other realization in some sense is as we think about it in national security terms, the insider threat. So the very same epistemology, like people who really believe it, it's not a game. They're not pretending. They really believe the conspiracies. There's no reason why they wouldn't be also part of our law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the like. And a couple just data points on that. I was also, looking back at the Carol Lenig's earlier book from this year on the Secret Service, and remembering, I hadn't remembered it until I reread her book, the members of the U.S. Secret Service who were on social media after January 6th, kind of supporting the insurrectionists. Some, a few members of the Secret Service. And the other one is back to Jeff Clark. One of the strangest qualities of Jeffrey Clark inside the Justice Department is this revelation recently and it's in one of the documents that was released by the committee, that he asked to be briefed by the ODNI on the Chinese thermometer theory, which means to me, like, he really believed that. Like, he wanted the ODNI to like confirm the conspiracy for him in some sense. Otherwise, why would he be asking for it? It seems, at least, based on the evidence that we have. So that's so deeply concerning. That's why we might have had and came that close to a coup, because somebody bought it. They bought what the president was selling, and what he's currently selling today.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for coming on the show. I really appreciate all of your insights.
Thank you so much.